Okay, well, welcome everybody. Today we're going to get really smart because we're talking to a brainiac and a wellness expert in her own right. We're talking to Rina Raphael, an author, a journalist, and a longtime follower of the wellness world. We'll have a long intro before this, but right now we'll jump right into it because she's sitting in a gorgeous office building and we won't have much of her time. So here we go. Welcome to the show, Rina.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we have a lot to talk about. First of all, congratulations on your new book. It's called The Gospel of Wellness, Gyms, Gurus, Goop, and the False Promise of Self-Care. Now, from what I've found, it looks like you've been writing about wellness for about 7 years. Is that right?
Yeah, a little over 6 years. I wrote for Fast Company magazine, and I've been contributing to the New York Times and LA Times. So, I've tried every trend, every gym, every product, supplements. Been on the speed for quite a while.
That's why she's glowing, people, if you can't see her. So it would seem like with that title that this book is an expose meant to blow the lid off the fake claims of the wellness
Mm.
industry, almost a fear of biting the hand that feeds you. But is that really what it is?
No, it's a really nuanced take on this industry because there are a lot of things that do work. There are a lot of trends that are helpful for women. A lot of people get a lot of stuff out of self care or their local gym or whatever it is. But as I'm sure everyone has realized, this has also become a very bloated industry that could just as easily mean meditation as it does activated charcoal toothpaste. And so the book is really trying to distinguish what is real wellness from sort of the snake oil that's being sold to us. And also, what is actually helping women feel less stressed, less burdened, what's propelling them forward, and what's actually potentially harming them.
Yeah. You refer to women a lot. Do you think men would enjoy the book too?
Definitely. I mean, there's an entire chapter on biohacking. And yes, the focus is on American women and specifically American women. But I think there's a lot of takeaways from this book that can be applied to many other sectors and to many other groups.
Yeah. And I started out as a journalist. So people, when I tell you that Goodreads described Rena's new book as vividly told and deeply reported, I don't really know what could make a writer feel better than that. Why did you decide to write this book, Rena?
Well, I really do. It's a very personal book to some degree. There are parts of it that are a little bit memoir like. I'm trying to explain to women why exactly wellness grew to what it is. Obviously, the industry is very different in the last 10 years than it was 20 years ago, or even what it was in the 60s. So, what happened to this industry? Why do women feel so unwell? Why are they so drawn to wellness? And also just where it's headed. I think so many people find themselves buying a supplement, going to a boutique gym, obsessing over an app, and they want to understand why they're doing it. So it really is sort of, it is a personal take of what I went through and why I was drawn to wellness because I became a wellness reporter after I myself became obsessed with all of these products. I had natural wine in my fridge alongside kombucha. I tried every new fitness trend. I mean, I did all of it. So I was definitely like, my own lab rat. And then in actually reporting on a lot of these companies, because I was working at Fast Company, I got an inside look at all of their marketing plans. I got to spend a ton of time with founders and leaders and marketing gurus. I mean, I interviewed everyone from Gwyneth Paltrow to Peloton CEO. And
Good.
so I feel like I got a take that most people don't realize. And I was also able to shed some light on how the media industry itself is also propelling this industry in some good ways and some not great ways.
Yeah. Well, I'll one up you on the time in the industry because I remember 19, was it? Hold on. 89 or 91, I opened the first resort on Hawaii that was offering Tai Chi classes.
Mm.
And the massage and spa was really focused on by the powers that be instead of just a little, forgotten amenity. So I remember we used to do like crossword puzzles of what's in, what's out, what's hot, what's not. People didn't know what Reiki was. They didn't know what
Mm.
acupuncture was. I mean, we've come so far, but this seeking that you mentioned is really important. What are people really hungry for? But let's go back a second to your origin story. You know, some of those outlets you work for, I'm sorry, they're some of the best known journalism outlets in the country. Like you said, CNN, NBC, CBS, the LA Times, New York Times. You had a corporate gig at Calm. How did you decide to be a journalist and then specialize in wellness?
Well, I didn't start writing about health. I actually really started my career at the Today Show overseeing lifestyle topics. So that was more like travel, a little bit of health, beauty, fashion. Um, but when I moved from New York to LA, I just realized that everyone in LA was obsessed with health. I mean, everyone was like drink. I mean, this is like maybe 7 years ago. Everyone was drinking green juice. They were talking about bone broth. They were trying all these new fitness trends. And it was really exciting. And I think I a little bit drank the Kool-Aid. I wanted to be a part of it. So over time, it just happened naturally that all of my pitches to my editor kind of reflected my metamorphosis because I was trying all this stuff out. So at a certain point, Fast Company magazine let me cover this industry full time. I think I was one of the first wellness industry reporters. This is about almost 6 years ago, 5, 6 years ago.
Right.
And I really, really enjoyed it. But like I said, I think the problem that I saw was that a lot of these companies were not evidence-based. They had really sleek marketing. And, I also track in the book that media is to some degree to blame, myself included. I've made mistakes in the sense that we treat wellness like fashion. There's always a new fad. And I mean, you see this oftentimes in top publications where they're talking about trends and products and supplements, and they're not checking with the right doctors. They're not checking, let's say, with toxicologists if they're writing about clean beauty. And that's because it's kind of treated like this frivolous thing, like, oh, this week, activated charcoal's in, but next week it's sea moss. And that's why a lot of misinformation is getting out there. And also why we're hyping up, let's say, apps or trends or products that are not necessarily evidence-based.
Well, that just reminds me of the good old food and diet industry. I mean, how many times can someone tell you that they're on some kind of keto, paleo, who knows what? And you're like, why? Why? Because you saw it on TV or someone said it was a good idea? What about your own body? I mean, it just really floors me every time.
Well, it's more than that. I mean, I think there's a reason why, especially here in LA, the first thing I ask people when they come over for dinner is like, what are your food restrictions? Because they're always going to tell me they're on some specialty diet or they're intermittent fasting and they can't come during these hours. I hear it all the time.
Yeah.
But that's partially, and I get into this in the book, is because most restrictive diets don't work. They're unsustainable. People get tired of them. Like people exhaust themselves. They end up deserting these diets. It's a guilt-generating machine. And then they put their hope in something else. Like, oh, I couldn't do this one specific diet. All right, I couldn't do Atkins. What else is on the menu? And they just keep basically migrating from diet to diet to diet. And that's actually what makes the diet industry so lucrative. It's just because if it's so restrictive, you can't handle it and you'll just keep putting your faith in other diets. And I think that's also really testament to what an optimistic nation we are. We just keep putting our faith in something else and some new supplement and some new diet and some new product. I mean,
hope in a bottle.
Right. And we're also like a very consumerist society. So we'll just keep buying something. And that's kind of the problem. You're right. And this is what I mean by that. This book is not, attacking wellness. It's trying to get to what is real wellness. I mean, I think everyone knows what they should be eating. Like, cut back too much processed food, try to eat your fruits and vegetables, but there's no money to be made in telling someone to have a moderate diet or even to go on a walk. I mean, that's not how magazines are going to sell themselves. It's not how a brand is going to make money. It's not how an influencer is going to make money. So all of this is part of like a bigger industrial complex that's there to make a sale. Unfortunately, that's what's happened to a lot of sectors within the wellness industry.
Yeah. And it was so fun. It's fun to have been in the industry and watch it and see the results of it. I went to the eye doctor for my annual checkup and he's like, oh, you're doing so great. Oh, blah, blah, blah. And I looked at him and I said, I'm going to keep eating vegetables and working out then. I mean, you would never think it has to do with your vision, but it does. In the end, it's everything.
Sure.
So all of this talk, we have to ask, after all your research, all the articles on the topic that you've written, what would you say is your agreed upon definition of the word wellness?
Oh, that's such a tough question. I mean, do you? I mean, we should ask the Global Wellness Institute. I mean, it's a very ambiguous umbrella term now. Unfortunately, it's kind of been a little bit corrupted. I mean, wellness is, supposed to be all of the things that we can do for our health independently that's not relying on the medical industry or our insurance plan. So that's nutrition, that's fitness, but that can also mean mental health, that can mean spirituality. It's a very, very vague term. And
Mhm.
because it's so individualized, because it's about what you, the specific person, can do to be and feel better, it means that anyone can shove anything underneath that sector. Gosh, I mean, playing with puppies can be wellness. I
Yep.
mean,
Yep.
anything can be skincare can be anything can be wellness now. And that's how it's kind of been butchered as a marketing term. And that's what really I was trying to get at with this book, about trying to make the consumer a bit of a smarter shopper of what do I really need to feel better and what am I being sold as a cure-all that might not have anything to do with health.
I know it's so hilarious when you go somewhere and I'm sorry to bring up diet again, but it's just so common in LA. I was at a picnic the other night and somebody's husband, who completely doesn't study wellness, said, I'm trying to go vegan. And I'm like, why? I mean, he's a big strapping guy. Why the heck would you be vegan? He doesn't have any allergies. And I just thought it's just, it's a reflex. They hear what's in the zeitgeist and they just want to do it. Now, this is the podcast, of course, for the Global Wellness Summit and the Global Wellness Institute. I've seen you at a number of their events, I'm happy to say, and you've written one or two or more of their annual trends that they name each year. You'd have to say most journalists try to keep, looking askew a little bit at formal organizations. What makes you trust these two to lend your name and hard work to what they're doing?
I'm going to really fangirl out here in that I love Beth McGroarty, who's
I do
the
too.
research director. I call her every so often and we end up staying on the phone for hours. I really, really trust her guidance.
Yep.
And I feel like this is an organization that really takes a nuanced approach. They're really like me trying to figure out what is real wellness versus, again, what is being sold to us.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've really enjoyed working with the organization. And I know that, potentially I don't see eye to eye with everyone who's at the conference. I know a lot of people might take issues with certain stances that I've taken, but it always feels like a very respectful community that encourages debate, encourages scientific evidence. And again, I'm not saying that I agree with everything, but, I definitely feel like this is a very smart and considerate community.
The thing that really convinced me is how the founder, Susie Ellis, who we interviewed a couple episodes ago, is dedicated to providing research results for free. She wants the world to be able to see this evidence-based research. And I find that so, you can't argue with that, right? If we're all trying to make the world a better place. And, but with those goals, we tend to, really help each other, I've noticed in the gatherings. So anyway, you recently, speaking of Los Angeles, where we both live, you recently wrote an article for the LA Times saying basically goodbye to the goopification of wellness. How would you explain then that we're in the midst of a course correction when it comes to wellness claims and the products and the food we use and all that?
Yeah, I'll try my best to summarize that articles is because it's pretty in depth. And so if people are interested in this topic, I would recommend they check it out. But essentially, I think that post-pandemic, there has been a slight course correction. Now, obviously not with everything. If you go on TikTok, you're going to find tons of misinformation. And the thing that really irritates me the most is sham supplements. I mean, those are a dime a dozen. Every influencer is selling them. But I will say that I think coming out of the pandemic, you see a savvier consumer who maybe realize that, they were barred from a whole bunch of things that they used to depend on, especially here in LA. Maybe they weren't able to go to their juice shop. Maybe they weren't able to go to their boutique gym. And by the way, I'm not knocking boutique gyms. I go to one as well. I love it. I'm just saying that people were able to reflect and say, okay, what do I actually need versus what I enjoy? And can I get the same results with things that are not hyper consumerist or elitist? People started going on runs. People realized that they could relax themselves with a good book or a cup of tea. They didn't need to go on a fancy resort. Again, not knocking the fancy resorts.
No,
I
I'm
love
not
them
either. I
too.
love them. Yeah.
I have a piece in Men's Health right now that's about, men's wellness retreats. So I'm not knocking that. I'm just saying there has been a little bit of a reflection of like, what do I actually need and what do I just kind of enjoy and I don't necessarily need to depend on. There was also a lot of talk on misinformation throughout the pandemic. So I think people paused a little bit and said, where am I getting my health information? Who am I depending on? There's that as bit. And then I think there's just trial and error. There are a bunch of people who really bought into the marketing on some, let's say, ridiculous CBD product or crystal infused water bottle. And, they felt like hoarders. It's like they have a cabinet full of the stuff that didn't work. And it's basically a little bit of like, been there, tried that. I'm not going to buy in on everything. I'm a little bit wary now. So there is a bit of that. And I do mention that, this piece in the LA Times really focuses on Gen Z. And that's a different kind of separate trend, which is that they're kind of rebelling against this sort of perfectionist, hyper-productive wellness ethos that was more aligned with the last decade of wellness and specifically millennials and let's say the girl boss era. In the sense that they don't need everything to be perfect. They don't need to have some gorgeous acai bowl for lunch. They don't need to, do beat yourself up workouts. They're taking a more realistic, calmer approach to wellness. And that's because they're very vocal about being imperfect. This is a generation that speaks a lot about mental health and what they need. So there is kind of like a little bit of a rebellion that's going on with the younger generation. And of course, I don't want to paint with too wide a brush. That's not all Gen Zers. It's specifically a little bit more of older Gen Zers, but there is a slight course correction in certain sectors.
So you'd say then that the difference between millennials and Gen Z is saying, show me more, right?
Show me more. And also like, I don't need to be perfect. Maybe, I can have some goldfish crackers and I'm not going to freak out that I didn't eat perfectly for the week. There is a little bit of a calming down, a more common sense approach. I had one expert who told me that they think it's because they were raised by practical Gen Xers. I mean, again, too wide of a brush, I'm not saying all Gen Zers, but I wonder if there is actually something to that.
Yeah, balance in all things. Peanut M&Ms will make a day better every now and then,
For sure. And you can indulge yourself a little bit. I mean, I am definitely someone who tried all the trends, including clean eating. And I can tell you firsthand that was really harmful. It basically gave me disordered eating where I was terrified of anything processed. So I think this is a generation that says, yeah, we're not doing that. That doesn't appeal to me whatsoever.
I don't even know what clean eating is. That just means everything's got to be raw, or what happens?
Yeah, so it's basically it's a very vague general term, but it essentially means nothing really processed. So whole foods. And it kind of goes to this whole kind of purity ethos that a lot of people find problematic. And as someone who's tried it, I will tell you, it is really hard preparing foods that are fresh all the time. I couldn't do it because I didn't even have the time for it.
Right. If you lived on a farm and that's all I did was cook, perhaps. But even then, I read on one of your news updates called Well To Do that influencers in China will soon need relevant licenses in their respective fields of expertise to share medical advice. I loved hearing that. Sounds like something that should happen here. You also wrote about experts fighting back regarding wellness misinformation on TikTok. How is that happening and to what effect?
Right. So I wrote a piece for the New York Times about scientists, physicians, and medical experts trying to fight back against the tidal wave of misinformation, specifically on TikTok, which is where a lot of younger generations, and actually it's probably one of the most popular social media platforms. They are vastly outnumbered, but I do feel like they're making a little bit of a dent in the sense that people are coming across more information that's fighting against, all of these crazy trends and all of these crazy ideas. So I am hopeful a little bit, but, as I explained in the piece, they don't make money, right? They're not like the traditional influencer who could sell some sham supplement or a detox guide. So they're really doing this during their off hours and it's not sustainable. They really need more support from the government, institutions, their universities. And there are, I don't want to say that isn't happening. I know the White House has been trying to help influencers. I know that there are organizations helping them. But, essentially they're becoming what they've been fighting against, which is influencers who are just really going out there and saying whatever they want because they can. I can't speak to what's going on in China. I don't know enough about that topic. And I don't know how I feel about that. I mean, who do you decide who is a worthy enough medical expert? Yeah, that's its own, can of worms I don't want to get into. But I am really hopeful about these new influencers and experts who are going out there and trying to engage with audiences who might not have necessarily come across them in years past.
Well, I laugh so hard because Murad is our sponsor on this season of the podcast. And I think our very own ad in this episode is from Dr. Zion Ko. I think she's an internist. And during the shutdown, she was bored. So she started TikTok and Instagram little messages of how to take care of your skin and your body and whatever. She amassed quickly 300,000 followers. And what you said about not having time, she's a doctor, so she knows. She spent her entire Saturday making her little videos, her mom's in them, her husband, her dad. It's hilarious. But you know what? At least she's a doctor and she's disseminating information, right? So that's great.
And by the way, just because someone's a doctor doesn't necessarily mean they can't spread misinformation. I mean, I definitely have some issues with someone like Dr. Oz, but I am really excited about these experts who are getting on there and are trying to some degree to just fight fire with fire.
Yep. And, we are trying, one of our goals is to interview the director of public health at Harvard. And can you imagine how busy that poor woman is? Here winds down the pandemic, and now comes monkeypox and polio's in the wastewater in New York City. So poor thing, hard calendar to get on. But this is an obvious question, but I think our listeners need to know, why would you say misinformation is a public health issue?
Well, obviously, I mean, look at what happened with the conversations around vaccines. I mean, of course, it's a public health issue. I'm pro-vaccine. People might take issue with that, whatever.
They're going to have to. Yeah.
But of course, it's a public health issue. And I mean, even in my research, I just saw so many women who were affected by wellness marketing, and they take very simplistic arguments and they transfer them elsewhere. I'll give an example. I spoke to a lot of women who took simplistic arguments from clean beauty marketing, that chemicals are bad, synthetic ingredients are bad, everything has to be natural, which, not everything that's natural is better for you. That's just not true. I will point to poisonous mushrooms, arsenic, a whole bunch of stuff. But they take these ideas and then they apply them elsewhere. So they'll say, oh, I can't have anything that's synthetic. Well, then I guess I can't have any medications. I guess I can't take the vaccine. And they get terrified by things like there's formaldehyde in a flu vaccine without understanding that there's also formaldehyde in our fruit. They don't even understand that. They don't have the basics of science, and they don't have, they weren't necessarily taught the critical thinking skills to really understand these marketing materials. So, and that's part of what my book goes into, is that we're terrifying women about certain things, and you don't know where those teachings are going to end up. And so I think vaccine hesitancy is one of the major issues of our time, specifically with women, specifically with parents. And I obviously have a lot of sympathy for women who are terrified over these things, but this is where public health experts are crucial in fighting back against that. And by the way, it's not anything new. I mean, a lot of this started, even over a decade ago. I mean,
more than that.
Oprah let, Jenny McCarthy on and gave her a platform. This isn't anything new, but, with something like COVID-19, it became essential.
I mean, if anyone, my husband was in the hospital, everyone knows who listens, 5 days with COVID, almost died. My sister's father-in-law died because he heard something on the radio about the vaccine and he was on his way to get it. I'm not getting it. And it was long before we really knew he would have come around, but he was 84, so he didn't have time. He's a healthy guy. He caught it from his daughter who had one vaccine, and she caught it from a coworker. And the coworker wouldn't wear the mask, coughed on her, and she went to see her dad, not knowing, So you think about these things, and this is life and death. And my kid's 22, but when he was a baby, the vaccine conversation was happening. My only kid, and we had a wonderful pediatrician, and I went and said, I'm afraid. I can't do this. And they said, we volunteer our time to go to third world countries where they don't have vaccines and
Right.
babies die. Would you please help? So what we settled on was they wouldn't give them all at once. We'd space them out. But he's 22 and he's a strapping guy. So thank God we got vaccinated.
Yeah.
Anyway, what I wanted to ask you too is, I've interviewed a lot of pillars of the wellness movement on this podcast. And one thing that really excites a lot of them is the Global Wellness Institute's wellnessevidence.com. Why do you think people should sort of take the time to learn critical thinking and try to go to evidence sources?
Well, I feel like those are two questions in the sense that everyone should learn critical thinking skills and learn more about science basics so that they can arm themselves. And by the way, I say that as someone who I feel pretty educated and I get hoodwinked all the time. I mean, the marketing is just so good these days. And in terms of evidence, I mean, that's hard too. There are so many studies out, and it doesn't mean that they're well-produced studies. So I see a bunch of science washing, as I believe it's called, in the sense that people will say, look, this must work because look at this study. But I mean, studies are a dime a dozen. It doesn't mean that they were well conducted. And so and I learned that lesson the hard way. I think that moving forward, I've also learned how to depend on certain experts who can decipher these studies if I don't understand the source material.
That's a good tip, Rina. Wow.
Honestly, if you want to prove anything, you'll find a study for it. It's so simple. There's a really big difference between good science and bad science. And so, yeah, I don't know enough about what did you call it? The evidence. I don't know enough about.
It's called evidence. Wellnessevidence.com. It's a resource on the Global Wellness Institute.
I don't know
page,
enough about that, but I really hope people look for evidence, but good evidence.
Yeah. And you can think in the spa industry, we used to say, hey, just do it. It'll make you feel better. You'll sleep better. You'll have more stamina without any proof behind it. But when studies come out, like I thought it was sort of obvious when the Institute did the study on fitness around the world, but to have the stats and to have the right people interviewed about it, and to take the time. It usually takes about a year for them to do their studies. So anyway.
Yeah. And I'll add one more thing, that when I was really researching the chapter on biohacking, I just realized that so much of the claims were based on studies that had like 10 people, or they were like 50 years old. I mean, they were so many of them were so poorly done. But you see it in a marketing materials, or you go to a biohacker's website and you would see like, look at the study, and you're like, oh, okay, there was a study. I believe it. Yeah. And that's normal. I'm not blaming anyone. I've done that as well. But that's what I mean by that. Like, you really need to separate good studies from bad studies.
Yeah. And your chapter on biohacking, I think it's chapter 10. Is it called something about the unicorn, or what is it called?
Yeah. Oh, you read it. Thank you for reading the book.
Oh,
yeah. We're kind of, I talk about how we're kind of looking for unicorns in the sense that, and listen, I'm not trashing all of biohacking, but there is an element it's very cutting edge. And there's just, in a lot of instances, the science just isn't there yet. Maybe it'll be there one day, but it's not there yet to take definitive takeaways.
Well, I have to tell you, I was invited, and I love the people that put it on. So I attended 5 weeks of a master class on basically biohacking, but it was held for people over 50. Now, there is a desperate group. People over 50 are clinging to, tone and, sleep and good sex. And I mean, it is, what can I try? What can I try? They're just so,
right.
So much seekers. The chapter on biohacking starts with Dave Asprey of Bulletproof fame. What really was your message in that chapter? What was the takeaway you'd like to share with people?
Almost exactly what we just discussed, which is that the science is still really, really new, and it kind of capitalizes on hope, and to some degree, wishful thinking. And, I didn't include this in the book, but I've written about this. I wrote an article about this for Fast Company, but I attended an Overcoming Death conference, which was basically like biohacking on steroids. It was people, scientists, researchers, but also just very wealthy senior citizens who basically wanted to, quote, overcome death or just basically extend the amount of time in their later years. They wanted to live better during their last few decades. And so much of it was called cutting edge, but it was really just people trying to grasp onto hope that they
Yeah.
could overcome sickness in their later years. And I think everyone knows that you can't really defeat biology. Maybe one day we will, but it's a lot of times capitalizing on wishful thinking, and to some degree it feels often very predatory. And
Yeah.
listen, I this piece that I wrote for Fast Company was very sympathetic. Like, these were people who were saying, I want to enjoy time with my grandkids. I want to see them graduate college. Is that so bad? I understood that. I really did. But here they were spending thousands of dollars on supplements or blood transfusions, all these things that weren't necessarily evidence-based yet.
Yeah. I don't that new gym that Bulletproof and whatever they call it now, Upgrade Labs has in
Yeah.
Santa Monica, that's like a rocket ship. That's like I'm going into the future. But, it always is the next thing that will make your blood circulate more, will make your oxygen pump more. I mean, I'm all about trying and that's good, but we also have to, be realistic, I think. And that brings me to another chapter in your book is one of my very favorite topics, the democratization of wellness. You start out by describing some of the over-the-top elitist wellness centers that cost about $1,000 a month. You can get cryotherapy, acupuncture, personal trainers, lots more than that. But down to the nitty-gritty, Rena, do you really see hope that wellness is trickling down to the populations who need it? I mean, let's face it, the majority of people work and
Mm.
work and work and work and work until their machines, their bodies break. And then they have to go to the emergency room and say, hey, help me. What went wrong? So give me some happy hope. Is it getting better?
I mean, I think we're having more discussion about diversity and income levels and just inaccessible wellness. So I am hopeful, but of course it's not where it needs to be whatsoever. And I think oftentimes, and again, as someone who's worked in media oftentimes just focuses on the sparkly, shiny, expensive things that come out of Silicon Valley. They don't care about what's going on in middle America. And that's partially just because a lot of, media has been completely obliterated on the local level. And also just because we know what's clicky. And so
Right.
and that's disheartening. And there's also a naivete about sort of wellness for lower, I don't want to say lower income, but just people who can't necessarily afford a SoulCycle gym.
Right.
Oftentimes I hear things like, oh, if you live in rural America, then, you just have the outdoors outside. You could just go outside and run. And that's not, of course, people who live in, let's say, a farm in Nebraska, it's not safe for them necessarily to run, outside at night. There aren't any street lights, or perhaps it's freezing half the year, or maybe they need accountability. Maybe they need a community to really access fitness. There are oftentimes, I think, like kind of a dismissal of middle America that really, really irritates me. And I say that as someone who's tried to pitch stories about middle America, and it just doesn't sell the way it does as if I say, hey, I'm going to go to the Goop conference. That's just the way
Yeah.
it is.
No, it is really true. And I don't know if our listeners understand when we say this, but the new digital norm for getting information. Um, I needed your opinion on this. How has traditional publishing, fallen victim to clickbait when it comes to wellness topics?
Right. So, as I mentioned earlier, wellness is treated a lot like fashion, right? There's always a new fad, and it's not pressed upon reporters always to check with experts as to whether what they're reporting on is actually evidence-based. But also, look at the media landscape. I mean, I saw this myself when I worked, more traditionally in media than I am now, which is that you always have to be producing. It's a 24/7 digital landscape. There's so much more competition now. I mean, it's not just that you're competing against other digital media outlets, you're competing against influencers. You're competing against social media. And,
Wow.
especially when it comes to wellness, I mean, which is again treated like fashion, you read these things to escape. And who does escapism better than Instagram? You know?
Oh my God.
So it's just become a lot harder. There's no more money left. So every reporter is just being pushed to the limit where they don't. And I felt this myself, like you're just not given the time to investigate things. And it's a real, real shame. And I speak to people about this and they're like, yeah, media, they're just, I'm so sick and tired of it. Why can't they spend more time on pieces? And then at the same time, I say, well, how many subscriptions do you have? Do you support your local media? That's the thing too. Or, I'll write pieces. I mean, this is like my pet peeve, but I'll write pieces that are behind a paywall and people will say, oh, I have to pay for it. Well, how do you think people like me get paid?
I had to pay $1 to read your article in the LA Times, and I got the Times for 6 months. $1, 6 months. What the heck? I don't even know.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's really easy for people to blame the media, but I would say that it's both parties. Yeah.
Well, let's give a few tips because our listeners are really seekers. Rina, if say something came up and it sounded good to them in the wellness world, how would you? Is there sort of a step-by-step for checking it out to see if it's reliable? What would you do? You're a critical thinker.
First, I'll say this, which is that I still buy a bunch of stuff that I'm not sure actually works, and I don't buy the marketing cure-all claims. Like, I love kombucha, but I don't think it's going to cure my gut. I just don't buy into it at all, but I love the way it tastes. So I'm the first to say that I buy a whole bunch of stuff that I don't think necessarily works, but I enjoy it. So that's number one. So if you enjoy something, gesundheit, enjoy it. But before I buy the cure-all claims on something, I do ask myself a bit more now, why am I buying this? Do I feel like this is going to solve a problem of mine? And let me look at the root issues first, meaning, this is like one of the arguments I have against self-care discourse, which is that I'm not against self-care. I'm against the way it's been butchered in the sense that, instead of telling people you might be stressed because your boss is emailing you after 6 p.m. or your spouse doesn't help you with housework, we just keep telling people like, you should take a yoga class, you should download an app, you should, take more cannabis. It's not telling people to look at the root causes of why they're unwell. So
minor detail.
So I just try a bit more to be like, okay, why am I stressed? Why do I feel unwell? What are the real issues? Why? Instead of trying to mask it with consumerism or some new hyped up product. The second I say is that before you buy in on something, just look who it's being promoted by. Is it by someone who has the right credentials and is respected within their community? I hate to bring up Dr. Oz again, but he's not necessarily respected by the greater medical community. So I wouldn't take his advice. I'm going to, take the advice that people actually know what they're talking about. Throughout the book, I talk a lot about clean beauty. If you are very concerned about the ingredients in your face wash, well, then I would go and seek out toxicologists or cosmetic scientists. It's not, dermatologists might not necessarily know the cosmetic makeup of a product. So I really stress to people to look to the experts within that field and how they're actually treated by that greater community.
That sounds like a lot of time, but
that's true too.
One of my rules of thumb, because I was a journalist when I started, is I go to 3 sources and I try to keep them. There's not the New York Times isn't the be all end all. That's one. The Wall Street Journal is another. Sometimes the LA Times, sometimes Fast Company. It just depends. But I compare and contrast. Now, what are they saying? What are they saying? And if you must listen to Fox News and get their opinion, okay. But all I'm saying is, it is out there if we want to take the time to compare and dig a little deeper. The onus is on us to do that, right? As savvy consumers. Now, I'm sorry, I'm going back to my favorite topic again, democratization. What is this Haven House place in Venice that you found?
Oh, yeah, that was a piece I wrote It was originally a piece in the LA Times.
Hmm.
But I checked out a co-living dorm in Venice Beach. And, I went in there, if I'll be honest, like a little skeptical, being like, oh, who are these kids who are basically living in sleepaway camp? I mean, we'd all love to return to our college dorm. We all want to get back to that. But, the more I spoke to them, the more I realized that we have a really big loneliness epidemic in this country.
Right.
For people who haven't read this piece, I think it's about 90 individuals who live in dorms in Venice Beach. And it's a wellness focused co-living situation, and they have group meals every night and they hang out with each other. There's like a co-working space, a meditation room for them. But when you realize that there's real suffering and a lack of community within America, it's a little bit more understandable. And also, if you live in LA, you know how expensive it is now.
Yeah.
So I left that place realizing that it was kind of necessary for a group of people. And, they get a lot of snickers. They get a lot of criticism of people who think that they just want to be forever children. But I think that when we think about the future of wellness, and I'm very big on the lack of community and emotional support, we do need solutions like this. Whether or not it's a wellness focused dorm is, of course, I don't need to debate the particulars, but I do think that we need to focus more on community. And that is something that is completely getting sidelined. Instead, we just keep directing people to download an app or to buy some product.
However, that said, you do mention Time Shifter in the democratization chapter. I love that app about fighting jet lag. And
Yeah.
if you do travel a lot or you're called upon to travel for an emergency, whatever, it is good to have that NASA-based science in an app and with instructions that are pretty clear to follow. I went to Singapore and followed it incorrectly and was like, what? When I got there, I came home doing exactly what it said and boom, just woke up like nothing, like I hadn't been anywhere. So sometimes these things.
Totally. And that's why I'm saying my book and my stance is not anti-wellness. I spoke very favorably of Time Shifter and what they're doing now for shift workers, people who work in the military and nursing, bus drivers in that sense. So of course, I'm not saying that nothing works. And by the way, I am like you. I was in the Singapore airport wearing sunglasses at night because the app told me to avoid direct sunlight. So I use Time Shifter as well.
Oh my gosh, the caffeine really scared me. I'm like, no, I can't give up caffeine, but it's the light. That's the secret. Okay. So from the title alone of your book, and let's say it again for the people that didn't catch it, The Gospel of Wellness, Gyms, Gurus, Goop, and the False Promise of Self-Care. Instead of saying it's all silly and it's all just over the top, I think you'd have to agree there's hope in your pages. So what might you think? What is the hope for the future of the wellness movement, Rina?
It's being a savvier consumer. I think it's also the industry course correcting. And just, again, and I feel like I'm just kind of beating a drum here, but like we need more communal systemic solutions. I have an entire chapter about one of the reasons that people feel so frustrated in their doctor's office is because we don't have enough research about women's health solutions.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, that leaves a window open for competitors to come in who don't always have evidence-based solutions. I obviously, like many others, have criticisms of the medical industry. And so there's a lot that needs to be done. And I think that unfortunately, sometimes with this industry, we're just focusing people in the wrong direction. And so I would love to see more conversation about community, medical research, and just things that don't cost a ton of money. You don't need the fanciest thing. You could go on a walk, you could go on a run, you could sit with a cup of tea. There's so many things that we can do that don't require, the fanciest goop product.
Well, I will say when you live in a place, we keep talking about LA, but there is such a class distinction of what you can afford and can't afford to stay young and wonderful looking. But I will say that a smile, talking, reaching out to people, listening. I had a friend over last weekend to watch a movie and, she's suffered from a stroke and she doesn't drive. So I went to get her and, she came with some other friends. And afterwards she said, Kim, you really helped me. I haven't been out of my house since Tuesday. And it was Saturday. And I said, sweetie, let's do a little alarm thing so that you wake up and you walk around your block as many times as you want because nature heals. And she said it with me, nature heals, right? So the purpose of this podcast really, Rena, is to bring people like you to the public so people can walk away with hope and with tips. And I love the end of your book. You have a list like check your biases, be wary of emotionally manipulative language. I can't make my computer work. Demand evidence, consider your sources, analyze intention, evaluate the root stressors. Know that science is always evolving. So these are all the things we talked about today. And we really thank you, Rena. Keep up the good work.
Thanks.
I can't thank you enough for anyone who has the guts and the stamina to stay a journalist today's day and age and not just dance on TikTok.
I mean, I'd love to do both. If I knew how to dance, I would be dancing on TikTok. But yeah, thank you. No, and I've always really appreciated the global wellness community. I learned so much from all of you guys, and there's always good debate. I love debating this stuff.
Debate is important. In fact, you guys were just on a masterclass. We have to remind people they can see it on globalwellnesssummit.com, where you talked about trends halfway through 2022. So that was pretty juicy. I think 800 people tuned in from, 90 countries. So somebody's interested in wellness. Do you think, Rena?
For sure. It's a global trend.
Okay, listen, I hope I see you in Tel Aviv, and I love seeing you today. So thanks for sharing your brilliance with us.
Thank you.